start our meeting. Welcome everyone to meeting number 141 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates, known of course as the mighty OGO. Please everyone, as always, keep your headphones away from your microphones so we can protect the hearing of our very valued interpreters. We have two guests with us today to start. Each will have a 5-minute opening statement. We'll start with you, Mr. Buckley, for 5 minutes. Please keep right to the time to stop me from having to cut you off. And we'll go to Mr. Potestio after that. Mr. Buckley, the floor is yours for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think it's timely that this committee is considering the regulation of natural health products. This is the regulatory issue that is of most importance to Canadians. By way of example, the organization I'm with, the Natural Health Product Protection Association, a single campaign just to support Bill 368 concerning the regulation of NHPs created over 500,000 citizen letters to targeted MPs. Citizens are extremely engaged in this because they're concerned that Health Canada is going to increase the regulatory burden through the self-care framework. But this committee needs to understand that the current regulations are far too dramatic and render us very uncompetitive in comparison to the United States. And I want to draw three major differences between how the US and Canada regulate natural health products. And I hope this committee understands we arrived at these completely polar opposite regulatory approaches from consumer pressure. So in the late 80s and into the 90s, both the FDA and Health Canada were over-regulating natural health products by imposing the chemical drug regulations. And the consumer rebelled with two messages. Do not regulate NHPs like drugs, and we want increased access, meaning we want a reduced regulatory burden, not an increased. Now, the citizen rebellion in the United States led to the passage of the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act of 1994, which does three things completely opposite to how Health Canada maneuvered us to regulate. And the first difference is NHPs in the United States are classed as foods, but we've been maneuvered into classifying them as drugs. The second major difference, and listen carefully, is NHPs in the United States are deemed by law to be safe. But we've been maneuvered into the drug model where our NHPs are deemed by law to be dangerous. And the third major difference is in the United States, you don't need government pre-approval to sell a natural health product. But in Canada, because we've been pushed into the drug model, we have to jump through all these regulatory hoops to get Health Canada permission in the form of a license. Now, what this has done is it's driven the cost of Canadian NHPs through the roof compared to our American competitors. And that has removed them from low-income Canadians who now don't have the option of using NHPs. And this has health consequences. And the curious thing is the sole message by Health Canada is that we need these regulations for safety. And we can safely conclude that that is not true for several reasons. First of all, we weren't having a safety issue before the regulations. The United States isn't having a safety issue with how they're regulating. And, you know, the big fraud is that every Canadian is free to import the unregulated natural health products from the United States and use them personally. And a large number of Canadians are doing that because of the price difference. And risk is always measured. There's a risk hierarchy. I mean, how many deaths per million of the population per year? And Health Canada refuses to tell us what that number is because there likely isn't a credible death attributed to the entire NHP industry per decade, let alone per million per year. And finally, if you want to have an honest risk analysis, so if we're really here to regulate because of safety, well, everyone on the committee knows well over 70% of Canadians are regularly using natural health products. And a large number are effectively managing health conditions, some of them serious, with these products. Well, obviously, there's going to be a health consequence to taking products away that people are effectively using to manage their health. But we never have that type of discussion. We're just told there's risk and we need to increase our regulations. These are the most unpopular regulations in Canadian history, and likely they're the most damaging. There are health consequences. And I'll just close, because I think I'm getting close to my 5 minutes, by pointing out I'm not suggesting in any way that we stop products at the border. That would not survive a Section 7 Charter of Rights and Freedoms challenge. That's not the answer. The answer is getting rid of this regulatory burden that has nothing to do with safety and moving more towards a model like the US has.
Mr. Buckley, Mr. Potestio, please. You're up for 5 minutes if you mute yourself, and the floor is yours, sir.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for allowing us to voice our concerns today from the industry. Despite Federal Finance Committee's recommendation to support the cannabis sector, no action has been taken by the government. It raises a question on whether the government plans to provide relief for the industry they legalized and set in motion. Approximately 40% of all bankruptcies in Canada over the past 3 years were from cannabis companies, highlighting the issues plunging the industry. This collapse underscored the urgent need for federal intervention and support in the industry. Cannabis companies face a crippling tax burden of over 45% of their revenues, far beyond what is seen in other regulated industries such as alcohol and tobacco. This has led to unviable profit margins, with many businesses unable to sustain the operation. Benefit from lower taxes and better regulatory framework is needed. The industry has seen massive wealth destructions as many cannabis companies raised tens of billions of dollars in capital investment, only to declare bankruptcies and have their facilities demolished and closed. Financial failure, despite the sector being heavily regulated, is rare outside the major market crashes, demonstrate the current regulatories and fundamentals broken. Companies that followed all required steps to have still been unable to reach break even after investments exceeding millions of dollars. The proposed 10% flat minimum tax would allow the financial pressures and situations have been advocated in industry leaders for the years, but action from the federal government is long overdue and needed. While Canada leads the world in cannabis production, its domestic companies are struggling under regulatory and tax burdens that make it more viable to sell products abroad rather than at home. The burdensome tax and regulatory are pushing consumers and producers towards illegal cannabis markets, which can offer lower prices without the strict government rules, and undermining the legal industry and raises tax revenue for the government. There has been a backlog of unpaid excise taxes amounting in over excess of $200 million in the last years. Companies are unable to pay the taxes due to the unstable financial conditions, further enduring the sector's stability. The wave of bankruptcy has resulted in sufficient job losses, affecting thousands of Canadian workers across the country. Without tax relief and regulatory reform, the industry employment base will continue to shrink. Overregulation in the innovation and potential growth of the new product development, research, intervention, competitiveness, and being limited by the restructuring tax regulatory environment. The cannabis industry is a multi-billion-dollar sector with potential for driving economic growth in this country and job creation. However, the over-regulation and excise taxation are hindering its full contribution to Canada's economic recovery. Thank you for your attention and the opportunity to contribute to this important discussion in Canadians' industries.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much. Thanks. Before we start our rounds, I just want to wish one of our members a very happy birthday. Mr. Souza, happy birthday. As a birthday gift, you can take all the rounds today. Go ahead. We have you for, you're up for 3 hours, Mr. Souza. Go ahead. We'll start actually with Mrs. Block for 6 minutes. Go ahead, Mrs. Block.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome to our witnesses today as we continue our study on red tape reduction. My first questions will go to Mr. Buckley with the Natural Health Products Association. I would have to say that as a member of Parliament, there are certain issues that we tend to hear back from our constituents on in a really big way, and I would have heard from many constituents after the introduction of the Budget Implementation Act last spring, and they were deeply concerned with the changes that were introduced in that bill to the regulating of natural health products. And I guess I have two questions for you. First, were there any consultations held with the natural health products industry? And would it be fair to say that your industry was caught off guard with the changes that were introduced in the Budget Implementation Act, Bill C-69?
So, first of all, you need to understand the history is this law that came to be known as Vanessa's Law in 2014 was first introduced by Health Minister Tony Clement in March of 2008. It was called Bill C-51. And the bureaucracy still remembers Bill C-51. I remember, and basically it brought in these $5 million a day fines and all of these almost godlike powers that Health Canada has. And the original bill just applied to all drugs. We didn't have the therapeutic product category. That came in with Vanessa's Law. I remember I had a meeting at the Prime Minister's office and we were being escorted out by Laurie Thronis, who was number 2 at the Ministry of Health at the time. And he explained to us that the mail going into the minister's office was coming in wheelbarrows. There was so much mail that Canadians were concerned. So Health Canada knew Canadians did not want these powers and penalties applied to natural health products. And so they waited until 2014, and Vanessa's Law created the category of therapeutic products, which, excluded natural health products. So the consumer was fine. The consumer was not concerned with fines that actually are very small when you consider the money the pharmaceutical companies make, but which would absolutely destroy any natural health product producer or practitioner for that matter. And nor was the consumer concerned about Health Canada having increased powers, but for a rule of law perspective that would be inappropriate for any branch of the public. So everyone sat still. I can tell you that everyone was absolutely surprised. Why would you put major changes into our drug regulation that the consumer was extremely concerned about into a budget bill? It's an affront to the parliamentary process. We were caught completely off guard. There would have been an absolute citizen rebellion. I mean, how often does a private member's bill get into committee, and yet Bill 368 did, because Parliament understands that the Canadian citizen is concerned about it. And I gave you the figures just from our organization, but other organizations like the CHFA and are also running campaigns and supporting Bill 368. So, but 500,000 letters from through our organization alone, it speaks broadly to the Canadians' interest in this.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you would be willing to speak to the huge financial implication for small and medium-sized businesses that offer natural health products, as well as the implications for Canadians who rely on these products to manage their health.
Right, and you're really asking a health question. I'll address concerns with this self-care framework, but when you've got, some figures are upwards to 80% of Canadians regularly using these products. But low-income people cannot afford them. And low-income people, if you go to a naturopathic doctor or a traditional Chinese practitioner, you're not able to afford these. So you've basically lost a fundamental right to decide how you're going to treat yourself when you're ill. We're going into legal philosophical problems. But this self-care framework is going to make the regulation of natural health products prohibitive. So even just on cost recovery itself, which has already been gazetted, Health Canada had a large Zoom meeting with the industry. And even with the new figures that they're given, and we all know that the goal is full harmonization, but there are players out there that are saying, we're not going to do business in Canada anymore. And almost every manufacturer will be reducing their line. And this is very scary, is cost recovery alone, we're going to lose the suppliers for the traditional Chinese practitioners that literally need thousands of products for a full scope of practice, and also homeopathic medicine. What's going to happen to the natural health community when we lose two major healing traditions within that community, and the rundown effects on the distributors and stores? And let's not even forget, the self-care framework, Health Canada is publicly telling us, well, you're not even going to be able to get licensed for any product for which you'd seek the advice of a healthcare practitioner, like a naturopathic doctor, TCM doctor. So now we're in a licensing scheme under, C.08.001 of the drug regulations.
I apologize for interrupting, Mr. Buckley, but we're out of time. Are you able to just wrap up quickly?
Yeah, we could go through the different elements of the self-care framework. All of them together are going to make it completely uneconomic. The NHP industry is rightly viewing this as the end game. We either get intervention or we're not going to exist.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kuzmierczak, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Buckley, for your testimony. Of course, this committee is looking at how do we balance the priorities of making sure Canadians have access to a product, but making sure that that product is safe for them to use as well. This is an important issue for my community. We have a company, an incredible company in Windsor-Tecumseh called Jameson. I've had the honor and the pleasure of meeting Jameson folks that work there probably about 4 or 5 times just in the last 2 years. It's a company that has a 100-year-old history. It has 1,000 people working there, and it's incredible. It's the largest national natural health product company in Canada, and it's the fastest growing. And it exports to 50 countries around the world. This is something that's, again, a pride of Windsor-Essex, and again, their product are exported around the world, 50 countries. And in speaking with Jameson, one of the things that I heard is that actually Health Canada is seen as the gold standard for regulation around the world, for regulation. And it actually provides companies like Jameson with an advantage against international competition exactly because people trust Canadian-made products. People trust the products that are created because when it has that Health Canada stamp on it, it means something around the world. And so that product can compete in places like China, in places like Europe, in places like the Middle East and Africa and elsewhere, because there is trust in a strong regulatory system. So I wanted to ask you to speak to that, about how in some instances regulation can actually be seen as a strength and an advantage for Canadian-made products because people trust it.
I wonder what we're doing here, because we're told we need this for safety, not for trade advantages. And what is happening in the regulation of natural health products, there's a name for it. Economists call it rent seeking, where you basically up the cost and up the costs so that you're left with a handful of large companies left standing that support the regulations and support increased fees to the regulatory body. So look up rent seeking. And Jameson would be one of the few companies that will survive and be in a quasi-monopoly. And if we want to have exports, why don't we have a voluntary licensing scheme that meets the same standards? And then those companies that want to meet that to export can do it. So there's different things, but we're talking about safety here. And as I say, safety is measured on how many deaths per million of the population per year are caused by an event. And, lightning is more dangerous than the entire natural health product industry. My understanding is lightning kills about 1 in 4 Canadians a year, so there'll be about 10. Well, we can't point to 10 credible deaths in all of Canadian history caused by natural health products, but I can point to you examples where Health Canada restricting products have led to death. So what are we doing here? Are we having regulations to make Canadian industry being able to export? Well, let's have voluntary standards then that are, whatever it takes to export. But we're actually talking about health products that people use. Some people survive on them. I was counsel for True Hope Nutritional Support, and Health Canada restricted access to that single product for a short period of time. The Canadian Mental Health Association held a press conference every time there was a death, and the court acquitted True Hope, finding, well, you're violating the law, but it was legally necessary because more people would have died because of the restriction of this single natural health product, which is now happily licensed by Health Canada. You couldn't get licensed back then. So I want to caution you. We are talking about products that people rely on for their very lives, and we never have an honest safety discussion. What is the consequences of our regulations? What are the consequences of ever increasing them, upping the prices, and dropping the number? We all know when you overregulate, you restrict. So, Jameson, and it's just funny, they used to be the poster child for health freedom. The decision C. Jameson versus the Queen was one of the best decisions ever. When they were a small company, they felt very differently. But if I was on the board of Jameson, I would have a legal fiduciary obligation to support this rent seeking because it would be good for my company, not good for the safety of Canadians, but I would have a legal obligation to maximize the share price of Jameson and profits for the shareholders. So we're talking about different things. We can export by having voluntary standards. We do in no way need that for safety, and that's Health Canada talks about safety. And you tell me how these regulations have saved a single life since they came into force on July 1st, 2004.
Mr. Buckley, I do agree that that obviously NHP products have a different risk profile than pharmaceuticals and drugs on the market. But within a 2-year period, there were Health Canada reports, there were 1,000 adverse reactions from NHPs that included 772 hospitalizations and adverse effects. And so there is a balance. I agree that there is a balance that needs to be struck within, again, making sure that Canadians have access to these products, but at the same time, making sure that that safety is absolutely paramount. Because one adverse reaction, one negative impact is one too many. Okay, thank you.
I'm afraid that is our time, so we'll now go to Mrs. Vignola for 6 minutes, please.
Just a point of order, could the witness be allowed a quick response? I think usually we allow a brief witness response if the member takes it to the end of their time. I'd be curious for...
Normally we would, but because we're short of time, because we have 2 panels today, but perhaps on Ms. Kusi's turn, we can get a response. Go ahead, Mrs. Vignola.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'm going to take a minute to table, and I'm going to wait for my colleagues to put on their headphones there to table a motion. Yes. Notice of motion. The following. Given that the media reported on Wednesday, September 25, 2024, that the Governor-General of Canada, Mary Simon, was still unable to converse in French during a visit to a community organization in Lévis, Quebec, and that she had to cancel certain activities planned during her stay in Quebec for this same reason, that the Governor-General had made a firm commitment to learn French by 2021 when she was appointed, and that she had again told Radio-Canada in an interview in 2023 that she wanted to be able to speak to Francophones by the end of 2024, and that tens of thousands of public funds have been spent on French language courses since 2021 21 with few results, that pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee invite witnesses to testify for a minimum of 2 hours each, no later than 15 days following the adoption of this motion. Her Excellency the Governor General, the Minister of Official Languages, and that the committee report to the House. This is not for discussion at this time. It is simply to note that this is very concerning in terms of a situation, and that interpreters could have been very useful, and that would have been a respectful thing to do, to bring one along if one cannot speak the language of the people on the ground. We can talk about this later. This is simply a notice of motion. And you will receive the motion shortly. Now, I'll turn back to my questions. To Mr. Buckley and Mr. Potestio. This question is for both of you. On April 10, 2024, Ms. Paulman, Vice President of the Canadian Independent Business Federation, recommended that the government use clear language and provide more flexibility in terms of compliance and regulation. So from what we've understood from what you've told us, the regulation is quite onerous and there are consequences to that. How can we ensure that the regulations are clear and flexible? Do you have proposals, any examples, specific examples? Thank you.
On peut commencer avec Monsieur Potesto.
We can start with Mr. Protestio, if you'd like.
Mr. Potestio,
Yes,
if you want to start, did you hear the question properly?
I did, but it was in French, so I didn't understand the question.
Middle button of the screen for translation.
Nat, he said there's a button
For Zoom on the screen. Why don't we start with Mr. Buckley while Mr. Potestio gets that done?
Yeah, absolutely. And John, it's right beside the participants button, if that's helpful to you.
Yeah,
Because we'll be looking at the same screen.
yeah, I got it now.
Yeah, so the question related to, the Canadian Independent Business Association, Ms. Palmer, saying, we need clear language in compliance and regulations, and we were invited to comment on specific examples. And, it's interesting because a lot of the costs in the natural product industry are really in the policy documents and the guidance documents and how those are implemented. And it's interesting, you can go through this onerous licensing process, which can take you an exorbitant amount of time. And then let's say you want to do a change and you file for any type of change, or you have to give a, notice of a change because, something minor has been tweaked. And then all of a sudden you're under a full scale review. And the industry is absolutely confused because you don't know from one time or next, what type of decision you're going to have. And there's not consistency in the application. That's not really a language question, except that, the policy documents and the law as it is not giving the industry clarity as to what to expect going forward. And I mean, so that is from every part of our regulations, which are quite detailed, right down to good manufacturing practices, to standards of evidence and the like. Because we're in the drug model, literally, as I said, the United States, the same products are deemed by law to be safe, and the FDA has to have actual evidence a specific product causes harm before they take any action. But we have to prove products are safe. I know of a company that couldn't prove that encapsulated parsley was safe because didn't you know it? Nobody's done a safety study on parsley. It would be very helpful, and this is going back in time, but, shouldn't we be clearer that if an ingredient is in our food supply that it's deemed safe for policy reasons? But I'll let John Frank go. I don't want to dominate the discussion.
Mr. Potestio, I'll have Mrs. Vignola repeat the question for you now that you've got the translation going.
Okay.
Donc,
So very quickly, Ms. Pullman, in April 2024, she's the Vice President of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, or rather the Canadian Independent Business Association, asked the government to use clear language and to provide more flexibility in terms of compliance with regulation. The question is the following. Do you have any examples or proposals of what could be done to simplify language in the regulation and to ensure that it is more flexible?
Yes, the main example here is to allow the cannabis companies in what they were brought into this regulated space to succeed as companies that we need them to succeed today. I mean, there's been a lot of recommendations done by the government and proposed by the government, but the government has to take action. The government has not taken any action at all in what's happening to these cannabis companies across Canada. We've seen hundreds of companies just close their doors, and there has been no action taken in order to. We were brought into this to these regulatory industries in saying that the cannabis industry is going to be supported by the Canadian government. There was no support at all in the industry. There was recommendations done by committees. They were presented to the government, but there was no action done at all. And we sit here today seeing that can we survive in this industry? Can we make sure that we keep Canadians' health as our main concern?
That is our time, I'm afraid. Mr. Bachrach, please go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both of our initial witnesses. This is an interesting study, and we've heard from a lot of different areas of regulation. And you know, as much as we could talk specifically about each of your fields, like there are thousands of regulations across government at different levels that affect different sectors. And I think what I'd like to start by doing is bumping it up to 10,000 feet and talking about the tenets of regulation, like the principles that you feel are being violated in these cases that should be applied more broadly across the regulatory environment. So, I take Mr. Buckley's point very well that if you don't have a safety issue, if you don't have a problem, what are you fixing? I guess is the argument that's being made. So perhaps to both of you, what are the lessons that can be learned from natural health products and cannabis products that should inform regulatory reforms across government?
John, if you don't mind me going first, I'd love to jump in, and I'll try to be quick. I love the question because sometimes we get caught up in the minutia, like you say, and we kind of forget to look at things from a broader perspective. The drug model, which came into force in all of the Western world in the 1930s, basically captures everything used for a therapeutic purpose. So anything you ingest, either to prevent illness or to treat illness or injury, is a drug. So the drug model's captured the entire field. I mean, I could say to you, you look dehydrated, would you take some water to treat your dehydration? I've just broke a myriad of federal laws. I made water a drug. And literally water is a drug if we use it to treat dehydration. But the second part of the drug model is we make it illegal. All drugs are illegal. And that except for the government will grant temporary exemptions in the form of a license, allowing us to access a drug. So how did we end up in the legal philosophical situation where in Canada it is illegal to treat ourselves or with anything or prevent injury, unless it's approved of by the government. That's a very, very offensive from a legal philosophical perspective. I mean, we're using ginger tea to treat nausea for 3,000 years, and now all of a sudden it is illegal, and we need to seek Health Canada's permission. So I think from a regulatory framework, we have to ask ourselves always, how does this affect actually the rights of the citizen, and is this justified? I mean, sometimes it will be, but we basically lost sovereignty over our own bodies because there are whole treatment modalities that are illegal for us to access.
Thanks. I'm going to interrupt for 2 seconds, Mr. Bachrach. I see Mr. Latimer's back. Once we're done with your round, we're going to suspend for about 30 seconds and then sound check Mr. Latimer. So after we do that, you can be able to participate. Go ahead, Mr. Bachrach. Sorry, continue, Mr. Bachrach.
Yes, I think those points that Mr. Buckley made are very interesting. And just as a follow-up, I'm curious about this line between drugs and non-drugs. And I'm curious how it's defined in the United States. And maybe this shows my ignorance around the details of the issue. But where would your organization, Mr. Buckley, draw the line? Because I imagine that you agree that pharmaceuticals, complex, sophisticated pharmaceutical drugs, should continue to be regulated as drugs. How would you, and at the far extreme other end, you've used the example of water. Where should the line be drawn?
So, first of all, it's important to understand, and, I don't have, unless the committee gives me, 5 minutes just to explain how the drug model is not designed for good health outcomes. You have to understand that the purpose of our drug regulations are to protect intellectual property rights. They're not to get good health outcomes. And you won't find in the Food and Drug Act or regulations any legal onus on Health Canada to get good health outcomes. So the reason why we've defined drugs so broadly, and it's the same in all Western nations, everything ingested is a drug if it's used for a therapeutic purpose in every Western nation. We're all captured by this model. So, but that, again, is a fantastic situation. I mean, I would argue that we need stricter regulation of the pharmaceutical drugs, and I could explain to you how our drug approval process for the chemical drugs is a complete fraud on the Canadian populace. So I agree with you there. But how on earth do we end up in a situation where the only treatments, even if they're perfectly, benign, are, we have to go through the government for that?
But
So,
Mr. Buckley, if I could interrupt, earlier you said that natural health products in the United States are classified as food.
yes.
So I assume they are
okay,
also
so
for therapeutic purposes.
Yes, but that's an exemption to their drug law. So their definition of drug is as broad as ours. And then the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act of 1994 makes an exception and basically says this class of product, they call them dietary supplements, but they're the same as our natural health products by and large. We are classifying them as a food, and then they even go further, and because foods aren't deemed unsafe, but they actually put in there that by law they're deemed to be safe. So it's because they've done a specific exception. It's kind of like when Vanessa's law came in and created therapeutic products, the definition excluded natural health products. So that's how they've done it there. But, but for the the dietary supplement definition exception, absolutely everything is a drug. And we had that option. I mean, we didn't have to go there, in Canada. And I think the real answer would be the Charter of Health Freedom, and just go to charterofhealthfreedom.org. That's basically the industry and consumer and practitioners got together and said, how do we solve this? And it's to create a third category, different than the United States, but a third category where the industry could compete and thrive.
Thanks.
I think most people. Oh, is that my time, Mr.
That
Chair?
is your time. We're going to suspend for a very short time to sound check Mr. Latimer, then we'll be back.
me to start.
C46, Miss Atwin for 6, and then Mrs. Vignola and Mr. Backrack to finish this off. Go ahead, Mrs. Kusi. 5, 2.5, 2.5. Okay, you just said 6. No, I apologize. 5, 2.5, 2.5. Sorry. I've only been doing this for a while. Go ahead, Mrs. Kusi.
You'll slip me back into the agenda.
Time for an opening statement, I'm afraid, because of all the delays, but you'll be able to answer questions or respond now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Mr. Buckley, Mr. Kuzmierczuk started very enthusiastically with an anecdote about a natural health products company in his riding before providing you with statistics on deaths and hospitalizations, none which I'm sure took place from the organization as a result of products from his riding. But he also left you with no opportunity to respond. So I wanted to go back to you now on his comments about the necessity for balance. As I said, he started out very enthusiastically supporting this natural health product business in the riding, was very keen on it, and then sort of changed his tune a little bit, flipped a little bit, switcherooed, if you will, in sort of providing these statistics. So what would you like to say in response to that argument from Mr. Kuzmierczuk, please?
Well, and thank you for giving me that opportunity. And I do recognize it's a little inconsistent to say here we need the regulations to, support the big company exporting, but look at all of the danger that's occurred under the regulations. And to be quite frank, and I expect the committee members will have this experience, is Health Canada doesn't ever really give us the raw data. I mean, I don't believe it. Every risk analysis that I've seen done by professional risk analysis people using government data, and they usually have to go to other Western nations to actually find evidence of, death. Health Canada is trying to create a safety argument. That's their sole basis for this, even though, as I said, if the committee gave me time, I could explain how our drug policy is intended to protect intellectual property rights. And I'm not the only expert that says that. So, but if we were going to have an honest safety discussion, so how do we get the best health outcomes? We're going to have good manufacturing practices. We're going to have procedures in place to make sure that people are safe. But we can't have this discussion just saying, well, we need ever stricter regulations without asking, is there a health consequence to taking products away? And Canadians are telling MPs, yes. Why are Canadians concerned? It's not, Canadians are quite intelligent and they know what works for them and they know what doesn't work for them. But Health Canada just says risk, risk, risk. I mean, when they were in front of the Standing Committee of Health earlier, well, I guess it was last year. I mean, I watched them use Ezekiel Stefan as an example of a death. Well, I'm sorry, I was counsel at both of the Stefan trials. And, I don't understand how his death could be attributed to a natural health product. We had basically Alberta Health Services take out of every ambulance. They destocked all the ambulances in southern Alberta of all the equipment you would need to get an airway for anyone under the age of 12. The ambulance attendants are weeping on the stand saying, we were telling management the first infant is dead. And that first infant was Ezekiel because they couldn't get a whiff of air into him for 8 minutes and 38 seconds because they didn't have the equipment. Now, how is that attributed to a natural health product? Was the Alberta Health Services person who, in my opinion, was criminally negligent in making that policy decision under the influence of an NHP? Like, Health Canada doesn't explain these things. Sometimes those of us that are aware of these cases are just shocked. But I don't believe the figures. If Health Canada will give us the case reports so that we can analyze them, then maybe I will, but they won't. And please, Health Canada, tell us how many deaths per million per year so that we can put it in a risk hierarchy like every other country and have an honest discussion.
Well, further to that, Mr. Buckley, you may be well aware that Conservatives had have put forward Bill C-368, which has passed through its second reading this past May. This bill seeks to repeal sections 500 to 504 of the Budget Implementation Act 2023. In your opinion, why would it be so important that we see this legislation passed as quickly as possible? Can you share why it would be a priority to see Bill C-368 passed as soon as possible? Thank you very much.
And about a 30-second response, please, Mr. Buckley.
And I am familiar with the bill. I wrote the first draft for MP Blaine Calkins. We've moved us into a category where the penalties and powers are so strict that there's now no discretion and no ability for companies to stand up to Health Canada, even when following Health Canada advice will lead to death or harm. And as a lawyer that's practiced for 30 years in that field, there have been times where companies have had to stand up to Health Canada to protect life, and we've lost that initiative. You're going to be destroyed. So whenever you're in a situation where the bureaucracy has absolute power over you and you can't argue with them, the bureaucracy has all the discretion. And if you look up the definition of tyranny, it just means absolute discretion. It's not meant to be a negative term. We just know bad things happen.
I'm afraid that is our time. We'll go to Ms. Atwin, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being with us today. My questions will be for Mr. Protestio around the cannabis industry. And I mean, in my community, in my riding, there are a lot of unregulated stores that have popped up. We're really dealing with what this looks like in community. We're thinking about, exposure for children and all these other pieces. And we also have there's a company in Fredericton, it's RPC, and they do a lot of the cannabis testing from across the country. And they can confirm that regulated cannabis products are free from heavy metals, from pesticides, from other harmful residues. And so it's kind of the part of the peace of mind for the consumer when they go to buy these products. And I would assume, they are associating some of those elevated costs with that safety piece that's there. And so because the cannabis industry is relatively newly regulated and involves products that the government has indicated is both therapeutic, yes, but also there are some negative effects for Canadians to consider. So in your view and in your experience perhaps with the licensing process and how you had your company get up and running, did that process find an appropriate balance between public health and safety and the ease of doing business?
Sorry, I'm going to, Mr. Latimer. Mr. Latimer, hold on 2 seconds. Because the both of you are in the same room, Mr. Potesti and Mr. Latimer, only one of you can be unmuted at the same time, just so you're aware. But please go ahead. I stopped the clock. Go ahead, Mr. Latimer.
Okay. I think that's a wonderful question, and I think that's an example of what's happening in society right now.
I'm going to interrupt, Mr. Latimer. Your microphone's died on us again. Maybe Mr. Potestio could answer.
Madam Chair, oh yes, sorry.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Now we can. Go ahead.
Yeah. I think it's
And now we can't. We can't. Are you? I'm not sure if you're doing something with your computer.
John, you're muting Tim.
You go. Hold on, I missed the whole question now.
Tim, you're good now because John's unmuted.
Yeah. Okay. Right now.
Okay, who's responding, Mr. Latimer or Mr. Potestio? I guess Mr. Latimer. Mr. Latimer, you're muted now.
But Potestio is unmuted. Needs to be muted.
And Mr. Potestio, I need you to. Yeah, Mr. Potestio, I need you. Are you? Go ahead, just unmute yourself, Mr. Latimer, and we should be hopefully good to go.
okay. Are you hearing me now?
Yes, we are.
Okay, good. So I think it's a great question, and it's very unfortunate. This is such a study in public policy and just getting maybe 2 words wrong, sort of thing. The words of greater than or less than in the Cannabis Act. And it has to do with the excise tax. And as a result of having it the greater than and the analysts saying, hey, we're going to be at $7 to $10 for a gram of cannabis, and it turns out to be $2. We've now turned it around and made it a lucrative marketplace for the black market to get back into the space. And that was the unintended consequences of just a flip in the words sort of thing. So now the black market is all of a sudden emboldened to go back into the marketplace. And not only are they emboldened, they actually can open up, as you pointed out, in neighborhoods. And they look exactly like all the other cannabis stores out there, except they're not doing the regulations and don't have to live up to any of the regulations. So a regulated cannabis like John Frank goes through all of the work, spends $50 million, a lot of family wealth and effort and time, and builds a facility. And every time he sells $100,000, because that word says the greater of, he has to give $1 of the $2 price to the government, about 44%. So if he sells $100,000 in a week, he sends $44,000 to the government. And the illegal guy doesn't have to send that $44,000. So he has that money. And who he is he's I'm going to call him a cowboy entrepreneur on the street. And he's all of a sudden seeing an opportunity. Before, he had to be downtown and selling for cash. Now he can be in the neighborhoods all over the place selling. He can use Visa and debit cards. He can take as much money as he wants. He makes $44,000 extra in a week. He starts buying fancy things for his partner, his wife, sort of thing. And he starts asking himself, because he's an entrepreneur, how can I do more? And he opens up a second and third location, sort of thing. And what you're going to be seeing.
Can I just interrupt you there? Sorry, I just have such a short time for questions. I just wanted to add a piece. In the opening statement from Mr. Protestio, he mentioned that 40% of recent bankruptcies in Canada were cannabis companies. And so my question is, did these regulations evolve over time? Was there a change that these industries were unaware of? Or were they just not prepared to enter the market? So what can account for that 40%? It's quite high.
It's such a new market. They put too much tax on it. The analysts got it wrong. They thought the price would be $7 to $10. It's only $2 for a gram. And that's where they got it wrong. And they never adjusted it. And now they've got a lucrative market for the black market. And what you're going to see, I'm going to call them Dr. Dooms, are going to be opening stores. You're going to be able to order online. You're going to be able to buy a small little joint with a little bit of lace and crystal meth on top of it. It'll be just sprinkled on top for $5. It'll be available to all of our children and into our neighborhoods. This is a travesty that is not being addressed. And it has to be with the timeliness of adjusting the policy. Okay, we got the policy a little bit wrong, adjust it. And I agree with Sean, Mr. Buckley there. There's too much control with Health Canada. They've overloaded the system, and they keep on overloading and throwing on bureaucracy. It's really created a nightmare. And these places are all going broke. And they've invested. For example, John Franks and family have invested $50 million in this. They need to close up because CRA is extorting them and saying, if you don't pay this money in the next 30 days, we're going to pull your license. And they're literally saying, we got 3 days for you to pay the money or we pull your license. Meanwhile, the illegal one is saying, oh, this is the best thing I ever had. I'm now out in the open. I can collect with Visa and so forth. And I'm innovative. I can bring new products in. And look at me go. I'm going to scale up and get across the country, get online.
Thanks. Mr.
I'm
Ladden.
able to sell a lot of product. Sorry.
Thanks. That is our time. I had to cut you off there. We'll go to Mrs. Vignola for 2.5, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Buckley, I'll be asking you the question, and for a question and clarification, I'm always open to improving processes. Regulation is onerous. I think we've understood that, yeah. Now, I want to ask a question to make sure I understand and about consistency. Now, talking about natural health products, I mean, oxygen is a natural product. I mean, sometimes people need extra oxygen. Obviously, we all need it. But some people will need more. For example, there are other products that are nitrogen is something that is natural, but some people need more, or, there are so many things. In the current regulation surrounding natural products, could it make access to these products more difficult for people? Or am I going too far? If the answer is yes, it could limit access for those products, how can we ensure that the products that are healthy, well-made, that people actually need for their health remain accessible to people who need them. Thank you.
And and I'm not sure I fully understood the question, and it might have been the translation. So, what is it that you're asking could restrict access? Are we talking about the self-care framework?
En fait, comment est-ce qu'on pourrait...
Actually, what can we do to make sure that the regulatory framework does not prevent people from accessing products that are healthy and essential to their health? For example, oxygen, in some cases, nitrogen. Can the current framework lead to these products not being accessible? If so, how do we ensure that this kind of aberration does not happen?
We're definitely, if the self-care framework, which has several branches, is permitted to proceed, we are going to lose most of our natural health products, and we're going to cause severe problems for many of our healing traditions. The way we solve this is we actually start asking the proper question. Just say, for the regulation of all drugs, be they chemical drugs, be they natural drugs, how do we get the best health outcomes? We need to review the entire system because the system isn't based on that question. And most people agree. Like, there's so many reasonable things. No one in the industry is going to say, let's not have
Mr.
good
Buckley,
manufacturing practices.
sorry, Mr. Buckley, to cut you off, but we are past our time. I have to turn it over to Mr. Bachrach for 2.5.
I love how you use the words have to. Mr. Buckley, I think that last question you were posing is a really important one, right? How do we ensure the best health outcomes? And surely in that somewhere is the use of high quality data to inform regulatory decisions. And, Health Canada has pointed this out as a possible shortcoming of, past regulatory systems when it comes to natural health products, or at least that's their claim, which is why my understanding is the Vanessa's Law piece has been applied. I wonder, from your perspective, how do we ensure that there is high quality objective data on which to base our regulatory decisions so that we're ensuring those positive health outcomes that you talked about?
Well, it starts by looking into asking the proper question. I mean, if you're looking for risk, you will find risk. If you're looking for harm, you will find harm. Now, you won't find, we've had the adverse reaction database reporting system that's been very robust since 1965. You're not going to find a credible report of a death caused by a natural health product in that entire time, which means, peanut butter is dramatically more dangerous. I don't want to talk about shellfish. But we just have to ask the right question. How do we get good health outcomes? And then start measuring that. Some of the leading causes of death in Canada are connected to the chemical pharmaceutical drugs. Good health policy might be, we'll restrict access to those until you've tried more safe treatment modalities, but we're not allowed to have that discussion. Nobody's saying there isn't risk with any type of health product, but if we're asking the discussion, if we're asking the question, how do we get the best health outcomes, which we've never asked in our drug policy, we're going to arrive at a reasonable place. And if we keep asking that question, we'll learn and learn and learn. But, truly, our drug regulations are there to protect intellectual property rights, not get good health outcomes. And, we just have to start asking the right questions, and then we'll know what to measure.
I imagine that's our 2.5 minutes, but maybe I'll look to the chair to inform that.
You do have 4 seconds, Mr. Bachrach.
I'll cede those seconds to my next colleague. Thank you.
Actually, that is it for this panel. And normally we have a bit more leeway, but we do have another panel of witnesses we have to get to. Witnesses today, thank you very much. We appreciate your patience in dealing with the mic and some of the translation issues. Appreciate it. If you have anything in writing you wish to share with us for the report, any briefs, you can certainly welcome to send them in to our clerk, and we will include them for consideration. We will now excuse you. Thank you again for joining us. We'll suspend for a few minutes to bring in the new witnesses. The floor is yours for 5 minutes. We are relatively tight on time, so we're going to keep everyone to their timeline. But please go ahead, Mr. Baloguet.
Parfait, merci beaucoup. Donc,
Thank you very much. So lightening the regulatory burden in a country like Canada is extremely difficult. Many reforms have been attempted in different contexts with mixed results. Here in particular, some initiatives have worked, others have not. In particular, there is the implementation of the 141 rule, where for each new rule, regulators must remove an existing one. This procedure has never really been applied effectively on a large scale. However, other measures have succeeded in changing the culture in certain departments, such as the small business lens, which makes regulators aware of the impact of their actions on small and medium-sized businesses with the help of a checklist. That said, regulatory burden has been a key issue for Canadian regulators since the early 80s. Canada adopted a number of administrative measures early on to minimize this burden on individuals and businesses. Now, regulatory impact analysis is the key tool in spearheading and the reduction and improvement of regulations. Regulatory impact analysis is mandatory for every new regulation or regulatory change likely to have a significant impact in Canada. Canada is a good practitioner of regulatory impact analysis statements, or RIAS. Our RIASs already combine several tools to control regulatory expansion and mitigate the undue burden of regulations on the Canadian economy and on our society. Our RIAS bring together the following tools: cost-benefit analysis, public consultations with stakeholders, a supervisory body, and checklists. Cost-benefit analyses estimate the net benefit of regulation, i.e. benefit minus the costs. Public consultations are sector-based and involve the main players affected or concerned by the regulations. They are placed where everyone can express their views. They are a place where everyone can express their views and put their point of view to the regulatory authorities. The RIAS process is overseen by the Treasury Board, which ensures the quality of the analyses, their rigor, and a certain degree of uniformity within the government. Checklists included in the RIAS already include a small business lens, provisions on intergovernmental regulatory cooperation and harmonization, and measures to facilitate the incorporation by reference of international regulatory framework. The elements respond directly to certain objectives of this Commission. So we already have the tools in place, considerable experience, and more than 25 years of data on rule streamlining and improvement in Canada. But there's always room for improvement. Not all departments have the same capacity to carry out thorough impact analyses. Not all cost-benefit analyses are reported in the same units, making it difficult to compare or estimate the total cost of regulation. The consultations that have the greatest impact are those that are the most exclusive and that are conducted upstream with stakeholders who can be handpicked. The success of checklists can be difficult to measure, as they are not necessarily associated with specific or identifiable results. What's more, tackling regulatory relief in this way often amounts to adding procedures on top of other procedures. While this may simplify corporate reporting, It often complicates the regulatory process itself. If we want to minimize what is asked of companies while remaining at the forefront of Canadians' needs in terms of safety, environmental protection, food safety, public health, and so on, someone will have to do the work. The information we need as a government to ensure a safe and predictable environment for Canadians will have to be developed by government itself if we want to ask less of business. In such cases, we're often faced with dry losses as companies have easier access to the information needed to develop good rules in Canada. So if the government wishes to modernize its regulatory process, it has several tools at its disposal to identify where the problems lie, either through the frequent interactions between regulators and regulated parties, or through the expertise conferred on us by 25 years of regulatory impact analyses. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now welcome Mr. Trudell. The floor is yours for 5 minutes, please.
Donc, bonjour tout le monde.
Good morning, everyone. Or hello, everyone. It's a little bit intimidating for me to be here. This is not part of my work, usually. I'm not a doctor. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a former police officer with the Quebec Police Force, and I also worked overseas. I created my own business with barely $1,000, and now I have 18 businesses that I direct, mainly in Quebec, and we have a business that has grown to nearly $1 billion in the private sector. We usually work in residential development, redevelopment of industrial sites, and other such businesses. I've spoken to a number of people, including Mr. Trudeau. This is a very apolitical process for me. I'm here today to answer your questions and also to explain to you in my life as an entrepreneur what are the difficulties I face and what are the real impacts in developing housing in Quebec. And that is dealing with various Crown corporations and various federal departments. I don't need interpretation. I understand English very well. I may answer in English sometimes. I'll try to be nice to the interpreters. I've learned my English when I was at the UN and policing at the UN. My English may be less polite than some of the English used in polite society, so I'll try to be careful. But I've understood listening to what happened. It was listening to the meeting, I understand that since I'm bilingual, I could one day become Governor General.
Thank you for that. We'll start first intervention with Mrs. Block for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for joining this second hour of today's meeting on red tape reduction, and also, as we have explored with many witnesses, the cost of government policies and the regulatory burden on businesses, which ultimately impacts Canadians and our economy. Mr. Beaulieu-Guy, I would like to ask my first questions to you, seeing how you are from the University of Saskatchewan. Would you agree that investments in schools and students is important?
Oui.
Yes.
Thank you. Recent reports show that the Saskatchewan education system is paying over $200 million in carbon tax annually. Isn't that money that could be invested in student education and research, like the research that you do?
Les fonds peuvent être alloqués.
The funds could be allocated in a number of ways, yes. Those are public funds. It's politicians who decide how to allocate them.
Yes, in 2021, the University of Saskatchewan paid $3.7 million in carbon tax. Prior to raises in the carbon tax, this will rise to $12.1 million by 2030. And according to the 2022-23 operating budget of the University of Saskatchewan, operating revenue cleared operating costs by $17 million. With such close margins, does the ever-increasing carbon tax not threaten the existence of public institutions such as the University of Saskatchewan and the research that you yourself are conducting?
Je peux pas établir le lien causal entre
I can't establish a causal link between the carbon tax and funding to the institution and also funding for secondary education or higher education. That's not my area of expertise. So those are things that can be very well distinguished. You know, the political inputs and outputs are different. I don't have an answer for you. I can't tell you whether there's a direct causal link between a carbon tax and research funding.
But surely when a government is paying that amount of money in a carbon tax, or a province is paying that amount of money to the federal government in a carbon tax, that is money that is not going to fund programs within their own province. I understand that you have done substantial research into the impact of stakeholders on public administrators and policy formulation. And I'm wondering if you could provide us with your opinion on whether or not the current government does enough to consult with businesses of different industries and then actually implement the recommendations made during those public consultations.
Oui, j'ai pas étudié en spécifique.
I didn't study the specificity or specifically the current government. For me, it's generally an public administration course looking at 2021 rather 2022. So I don't have any, or rather 2001. So nothing particular for this current period. Now, in terms of funding, there are specific mechanisms where all stakeholders who will be impacted by the regulation can take part, can be consulted. There's a forum that is provided through public consultations. And it's quite well documented that large businesses especially, but businesses have very close ties with public administration when it comes to creating regulation. So that's one of the types of stakeholders that has the most interaction with government regulators, whether that's at the federal or other orders of government. What I've discovered in my research is that consultation with stakeholders, whether that is consultations that are done beforehand that are more bilateral or more open ones, the notice in common, both types of consultations can have an impact on the regulation. What I've noted is that when businesses show up, the only ones to show up at these consultations, they'll often be able to reduce the amount of onerous and undue regulation. So they'll have interactions with regulatory parties and they'll be able to impact the amount of obstacles because they are the ones that have the most information on their activities at the time, and regulators are better able to understand their points. And if I may continue.
Appreciate that my time is limited. On the Johnson Shoyama website, it states in relation to your research, and I quote, "His research challenges the commonly held belief that public consultations are, at best, useless or at worst, another venue for corporate lobbying." Would you care to comment on that?
Just briefly, please.
Oui, en fait, c'est que...
Yes, well, what I'm saying is that public consultations are more lead to more broad changes the broader they are. There's more of a diversity. What an issue that seems simple can become more complex and can lead to further government regulations. So as I was saying earlier, the industries when they are consulted directly can get their points across more easily. However, when there are other stakeholders also, they can really come and complicate that. For example, if there are citizens and NGOs.
I'm going to go to Mr. Sousa, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm going to share my time with my colleague. But before I do, I'd just like to ask a quick question in regards to the professor in respect to the jurisdictions that are engaged in the red tape and regulatory affairs. And prior to you being here, we had someone from the cannabis industry, also through the medical health issue with natural products. I think there was somebody else that was supposed to be speaking about payday loans legislation, all of which requires provincial regulatory matters as well. Can you comment on the consultation process that's been had in regard to some of these issues, and where are we making more advancements?
J'ai pas aucune expertise sectorielle.
I don't have sector expertise necessarily, whether it's the health sector or others. So I'm really looking at the approval process for regulation. So I couldn't identify a specific problem in a specific sector. However, when we held consultation on legalizing cannabis, that was one of the broadest consultation that was led across government, because it really changed the paradigm. We were taking an illegal product that was changed to being used for medical purposes and then for recreational purposes. So I know that the health experts, for example, Health Canada, people working at Health Canada had a lot of impact. But for the other specific policies you're mentioning, I don't have specific information.
Thank you for that. I know that between 2013 and 2016, we just heard a member from the Conservative Party talk about the concerns for the universities. Well, back then, there was $2.6 billion in cuts through the science-based ministries and associations, including some universities, that required some support, all of which would be to advance our technology and our advancement and our regulatory affairs in regards to some of this. With that, Mr. Chair, I'd like to pass on my time to Adanush Vladimirovich Kuzmirchak.
Well done, Mr. Kuzmirchak. You've got almost 4 minutes.
Hey, great. Thank you. Thank you very much for that that introduction. I will allow it because it's your birthday. I do have a question for Professor Beaulieu-Gay. I wanted to ask you, as was mentioned already before, the website, your website on the University of Saskatchewan states that your research challenges the commonly held belief that public consultations are at best useless or at worst another venue for corporate lobbying. So you're basically saying your research indicates that public consultation, stakeholder consultations are important and they do have an impact. And that's been my experience. So I wanted to give you 2 examples, going back to the natural health product discussion that we had. I too was concerned about the impact of costs, specifically in cost recovery, to be able to fund oversight and accountability. So I was concerned about the cost, and I know that other small businesses, especially in that space, were really concerned about the cost of that oversight. There were thousands of stakeholder consultations that were accepted to Health Canada. There were about 4,600 submissions. They talked about everything from the burden of labeling to, again, the burden of cost for cost recovery. Since that time, very recently, Health Canada responded with changes to cost recovery. So they lowered the total cost of cost recovery by half. And they also, in some fees, they actually reduced the fees by up to 72%. They also phased in the cost recovery approach over 7 years to make sure it has less of an impact and allows businesses to adjust. And it also included, on top of that phased-in approach and the reduction in fees, it also kept the small business discounts that were already existing, because again, it recognized the fact, it heard from Canadians the potential impact this could have on small businesses. So it kept the small business discounts as well too. So that's just one example of where the interaction between Canadians, small businesses, and Health Canada had an impact. I would say a large impact on proposed regulations that were going to come into force. Can you speak a little bit about how stakeholders and non-experts actually do influence the regulations that come out of organizations like Health Canada?
Ouais, c'est surtout que
Well, Of course, the bureaucrats or public administrators don't have all of the information at their disposal to be able to anticipate all of the possible consequences of a regulation. And we understood that pretty quickly. So that's why there is this obligation to consult people on the ground to improve regulation, which is what we want to do. Now, we're beyond that era where the policies and regulations were just imposed by public regulators on anyone. Now there are doors that are open. There are listening ears for people to comment. However, these avenues can be inaccessible to some parts of the population. And it's those who interact most often with regulators who have the biggest impact. For example, they'll adapt their language, they'll know the specifics of each regulation. It's very difficult for people, especially in areas where there's expertise that's required to have a real impact. So overall, there can be benefits for consultations, and it can help identify stakeholders' future legal processes or so on, or further problems. But now the fact that...
I'm afraid that's past our time. Mrs. Vignola, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Trudel, thank you for being with us today. In your business, how many people are assigned to paperwork, straight to paperwork? Well, I would say about 10 people easily. Just out of the 5 lawyers who work with us, 2 or 3 at least work on compliance, not just at the provincial level, but federal level also. It's often through corporations that, for example, CMHC, that the federal government will be involved. There are also a lot of consultants, even if I don't employ them directly as one of my employees. There are engineers also. There are all kinds of consultants that we have to work with. So if I add all the people who work directly on this in my businesses, plus all the consultants we have to engage with also, I mean, I don't know what the exact costs are, but we'd be talking about millions and millions of dollars each year that it costs us to comply with regulatory expectations and things that are complicated for no reason. Could you give us examples that show us the limits of compliance criteria, especially in terms of preserving heritage buildings? Well, lately I had discussions with people from the Development Bank of Canada. They're very dedicated. They do great work. They do a lot to help entrepreneurs in Canada. But there are limits. Often what I find is too bad in Crown corporations, and I'll say it in bad French here, but I feel like we've lost the common sense, or our common sense. Sometimes I see it in people's looks that people are trying to look for which of the compliance tables, is it the third tab, fourth paragraph, that they can use to answer my question. I was talking to somebody from that bank recently, and we were looking at renovating this building, a specific building, at Place de Lys, and I asked them to come with me. They said that would be a good idea, and now they started explaining to me the regulatory framework. There were 14 sub-questions and so on, and there's no little bit that deals with heritage buildings that we're restoring to their original, their original state. But if you go through the eco-energetic route or so on, the green energy route and other ways, maybe we can get to it. So now we're getting people who are helping us, public servants who are helping us get around regulation, their own regulation, to try to get the work done. I mean, that's a complete lack of common sense. Now, all of that, does it allow you as an entrepreneur to show innovation. You know, instead of destroying heritage buildings, you're restoring them. But that takes a long time. We need to thank you for your work because in North America, you know, it's as if everything's developed only for 50 years. Does this compliance or these compliance requirements prevent you from being able to innovate and do more? Well, let's take somebody, for example, work we do with the CMHC. It has done all it could do to support the housing market in Canada over the past few years. If it had not done all of that hard work, I mean, the situation would be catastrophic. Now, in terms of our projects, we take, for example, old malls, and then we take away bits of it, for example, parking lots and so on, and then we integrate it with a hotel, a worldwide hotel, or a university, or so on. And we're constantly seeing regulations that were not made for that because it's a new economic model during this housing crisis. That's right, to try to change the type of building that it is. So now I have to talk to people from the Quebec government, for example. There can't be too many retail spaces in the former mall business because we deal with residential properties. And so now there's constant compliance issues. And it's really, really too bad that there's no transparency. There's no transparency in Crown corporations that we deal with. We're never able to fully understand how to get through this compliance regime. We get no answers. And sometimes I've even heard we are a Crown corporation. We do not talk with private parties. I mean, that's really frustrating for us because that's millions of dollars now and that it costs us. And then I have like 10 people on this and then consultants also working on it. And I can never understand how to go forward on it. Often I say that if we took the model of the 12 works of Asterix, which is a comic book based on Greek mythology, then that would help us a lot. Thank you, Mr. Trudel. So if I understand what you're saying is that you're not criticizing the institutions themselves, but it's the steps. No, I mean, the CMHC, the BDC, they're doing such excellent work. And they're really important institutions for Canada. But there's an issue of philosophy, of transparency, and they're going to have to look at things from the client's perspective. So the CMHC, the Business Development Bank, the BDB, what are they going to do? How are they going to look at things? We're going to have to talk to entrepreneurs, or they're going to have to talk to us entrepreneurs to try to find solutions to all of this. Thank you very much.
Very much. Mr. Bachrach, please go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd love to ask some questions of Mr. Bilyauguy. I hope I'm pronouncing that close enough. Bilyauguy? Okay, I got a nod. There we go. Maybe starting out with a really high-level question. I think, the concept of regulatory modernization is based, in most cases, I believe, on this premise that regulations in our country are becoming more onerous and more complex. And I certainly hear from a lot of small businesses who are frustrated by the complexity and the requirements of regulatory processes. Is there data to suggest that that is the case countrywide, that on the whole, in general, Canada's regulatory environment is becoming more onerous?
Oui, c'est assez bien documenté là,
Yes, it's quite well documented. There have been efforts to reduce regulatory expansion. I mentioned a few during my opening statements. What we have to understand also, it goes back to what Mr. Trudel was saying, small businesses are more vulnerable to the regulatory load when it increases because they can't, for example, hire lawyers or so on. As I mentioned earlier, they have less access to regulators because it's often the big businesses that will be contacted because, at the beginning of the regulatory process, because when we start thinking about new regulations, usually regulators will think about the big players in the area first, and then NGOs and so on. That's where regulations can have a big impact also is among small business owners. There's something that's also complex, but that we can see coming, is that society is also getting more complex, and so are markets. So I don't think we will be able to reduce regulatory burden on AI, for example, because we have disruptive new technologies and we need to adapt. So it also, things move along with society, but we also don't want to see over-regulation as we saw in the US. So every 10 to 15 years, there are studies such as this one to try to see how we can alleviate the burden, because we do need rules, but we need them to be done and made correctly.
I think your point about the differential impact of regulations on small businesses and large enterprises is a really important one. And I wonder if government's efforts at regulatory modernization should focus on those regulations that impact small businesses disproportionately. Is that a fair recommendation?
Oui, je crois bien. Puis en plus, les grandes entreprises.
Yes, I believe so. And often big businesses and companies also have contacts overseas, and they have entire departments to deal with international regulation. They have experts working for them. So whatever regulatory framework they are sent by the federal government, they'll be able to react. That's not the case with small businesses that have a harder time matching the regulatory pace, because that's not what they're there for. You know, they have clear missions, clear objectives. They don't have departments to deal with this or connections with the regulatory departments to see what's coming. And often they're not at the table when a new rule is created or changed. So yes, if there's modernization to do, and if the regulatory framework gets more complicated, small businesses that will pay the price.
I'm curious about regulatory capture. Could you provide for the committee a definition of what regulatory capture is, and also your recommendations for how the Government of Canada can avoid regulatory capture across the regulatory environment?
Oui, merci. Bon, la capture réglementaire.
Regulatory capture is when people creating the regulations yes, they rely too much on key or certain key players to create the regulations. They'll get all their information from the same source, and that will create problems and will skew the regulation, and it will, for example, be used to create obstacles for competing businesses and so on. One of the easiest examples is, or things to work on rather, is transparency. We have to make sure that people know when certain parties are being consulted. There's also in the notice and comments whether the comments and so on are sincere. We want to avoid the appearance of a conflict of interest. For example, there's the Tagartine and other publishing houses. Some businesses were giving public administrators points for discussion, and the regulation was almost designed by business and by the private sector before consultations were held and before other parts of the sectors could have their input. For example, NGOs. Those businesses that have very frequent interactions with the regulators, well, they might have an outside say if they are not sincere in their dealings. So transparency would help with that. Who did you talk to? How often? And if those discussions were held openly, there would be less of this appearance of conflict of interest when creating regulation. So transparency is a solution.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to our second round. We'll start with Mr. Gord. Mr. Gord, welcome back to OGO. The floor is yours, sir.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Mes questions vont être pour Monsieur Trudel.
Thank you very much. My questions will be for Mr. Trudel. Your testimony was like music to my ears. One of the biggest challenges we're going to have over the next 10, 15 years is going to be construction, housing, and so on. And it's true that regulation is very, very onerous. I would encourage you, if you're asked for money again, if you could leave your lawyers to get in touch with us and to tell us where we can reduce all of that burden. But how much do you think it would have slowed you down in your work? Have you lost years? Have you lost clients? Have you lost projects or open doors? Because we need a lot of them. Doors, literally doors. We need more of them in Canada right now. I mean, are there things that are slowing you down? Well, we're really looking at the number of years. That's how long things are delayed. How many years behind are we? I was looking at the media almost all day in the province of Quebec, in the Quebec area. One of the projects we announced recently, which again will be delayed by 12 months because of municipal regulations in this case, what we're doing is a new phase for building hundreds of housing units for over $200 million. And it's to help people with disabilities also. The CMHC decided during the insurance process to cut the funding by $60 million. I still don't know why. Thankfully, we were able to cover that amount. We were able to move forward with the project. But what's the consequence of that? That means that 3-4 years from now, when we get to phase 5, 6, 7 of the same project, well, the $60 million that we could have used then won't be there anymore. So now I have to hope to be able to go back to second roll of funding with the CMHC, but that's not what it says. It tells me, the regulation tells me I'm not supposed to do that. Maybe I won't be able to reopen the case. Of course, I'm going to be charged many millions of dollars for a reanalysis of the same project. I mean, we spend our days paying fees and so on without knowing why. Now, coming back to compliance. From what you said earlier, I understand that you had a difficult time being able to find somebody who could take charge within the organization. For example, if it's not part of compliance or if it doesn't work within this regulatory framework, we don't know, we can't go this way or that way. I mean, it could be like a bank manager. You need somebody to be able to say, yes, let's go, let's do this way or that way. I mean, if when you have to manage so many things, I mean, well, I would go even further than what you said. I regularly hear, William, I know that's the right thing to do. I know you're right, but our rules, our internal rules, for example, at the CMHC, don't allow us to do that. What do we do? That's my question. Everybody understands that that's what we need to do. What can I do? I call up my MP. My MP says, well, I understand your problem, but it's a Crown Corporation. There's nothing I can do. And then the Crown Corporations tell me, when I call them up, they say, well, that's a political problem. I can't deal with that. I'm a Crown Corporation. And then I talk to other people, and they always say they can't help me. I try to do different things, take different angles. I ask my architect to look at the project for an 8th time to try to make it fit within the regulations. And then, you know, we lose 2-3 years, and people don't have housing during that time. Does the owner's paperwork have to be reduced by 50-60% to make housing be built faster? I mean, people are going to end up outside, sleeping outside because there won't be enough housing. I mean, how much do we need to reduce it by? 50%, 60%? You know, if there's a 15-page form, that it need to be reduced? Well, I'll give you an example. With the CMHC, if you have projects under $100 million, we have to obtain a special certificate. I understand why it's a rigorous process to try to get this license, but we have to show each year to the CMHC that we can do our job properly, and we have to have a risk analysis of our funds, our capital, and so on. That process is spread over 12 months, and then it has to be done each year. Last week, we finished the one from last year. It took nearly 6 months of analyses to provide us with a compliance certificate that lasts 12 months. And then I'm going to be asked questions in just a few months. And then I'll have I'll be there for 6 months with a compliance license that doesn't last that long because I'm going to have to restart all over again. Okay, I don't have much time, so perhaps I'll need the answer in writing, but can I get it in writing, please? Yeah, is it possible to build affordable housing in Canada now? It's possible, but it's very difficult. You have to find ways to do that. You have to work hard. You have to have a dedicated team. You have to work within your community, with the community organizations. It's still possible because we're managing to do it, but it's very, very difficult. Don't forget, each time that one of the three government orders of government rather, creates a new tax, we see it in the housing sector. For us, we count things in housing units. With Carses kilometers here, it's housing units and increases the price.
We'll go over to you, please, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses for joining us today and providing some very, very interesting comments and testimony here. I'd like to sort of go back to Mr. Trudel on can you expand on some of the challenges you talked about? We have a couple of projects that we were able to successfully get done in Richmond, British Columbia, with respect to affordable housing for women with children, and people in the vulnerable members of our community. And I see some of these things. And this one project specifically on Steveston and Railway, it's an 18-month project. So I look at that and say, wow, because I understand how long it does take to get things done. But it took the partnership between the municipality, the federal government, and in this specific project, it was a direct one with the municipality. So what are some challenges? You said like all levels of government, if they can work together, can they? What kind of things need to be done to improve, improve the regulations to get things done quicker? In your estimation, some recommendations you can make.
Excellente question. C'est une excellente question parce que le logement.
That is an excellent question. Housing in Canada? Okay, let's go from the top with the federal government. It will mostly influence what I call money for funding through the CMHC and others. Now, looking at the province of Quebec, that's the one I'll mention since this is the one I know, the provincial government will impose laws and so on for land use and so on. The municipalities on their level will have to put in place all of those regulations. And I know that those three orders of government don't necessarily talk to each other on a regular basis. So currently, with this housing crisis, we're going to have a national housing strategy where there are standing or permanent committees involving all three levels of government so that decisions can be made, they can share information and simplify the regulatory framework at all three levels at the same time. Because if just one level works on that, you'll only have a partial good results, of course.
Thank you. And if you look, and I noticed how you some of the work that you're doing with the say heritage buildings and some of these other things. There's existing regulations in each unique municipality. So it's just like what is the work that goes into it? You have to provide some type of a proposal to show the importance of the project. Like, so how long does it take to sort of do that work just in order to just get started?
Projet de redéveloppement. Pilotons présentement.
Inaudible for the interpreter. Now, in the region of Quebec, there was a former mall from the 60s, 3 million square feet, just beside the Videotron, an exposition center very close to the center of government. I bought it for $60 million in July 2018, and I was able to get a zoning change at the end of 2022, despite the fact that the community really supports the project and all the for neighborhood committees around our property, and the fact that over 60 community organizations really spoke out to support this project despite all this work. It took me nearly 5 years to get the right zoning changes to create just one housing unit, even though the whole community was massively for the project, because there were so many rules at 3 different levels and that I had to work with one by one.
Yeah, and that speaks to the challenges. And I've seen projects, be introduced and then, get derailed because maybe there's a small, certain special interest group in the area that doesn't want something to happen. So it's a lot of not just the levels of government, the communities involved, and so many different things that can either get projects going or ultimately get halted. Maybe I'll ask Mr.
I'm afraid you don't have any more time, Mr. Baines.
Okay.
That's it, but thank you very much. We'll go to Mrs. Vignola for 2.5, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I really appreciate it. Mr. Tudel, we were talking earlier about the number of people you need to fill out the paperwork and some inconsistencies, difficulty reaching objectives due to these inconsistencies and the lack of communication. But in specific terms, for the common mortal coming to you, the housing unit, how much more expensive is it per month? Well, it's a little bit difficult. Our internal team has looked at it a little bit. For example, all kinds of taxes, school taxes, property taxes, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there are certain taxes that at the federal level that have been eliminated. That's great, but there's still the TVQ in Quebec. It's no joke. There's a tax to get an elevator, and to get elevator music, that's another tax. Putting all that together, that's $500 a month, $500 per month per housing units that we don't get. That means that the first $500 that people pay us, I don't see any of it. And at the $501st, I haven't even started building the first housing unit, and costs have doubled over the past few years. Now, in the Quebec region, there's a CMHC program that's an excellent one that has been miraculous. It has changed people's lives. It has really changed people's lives to have a brand new, great quality housing unit for people without housing. Now, to be able to build 2-bedrooms, 3-bedroom houses for families who have been reconstituted, or single-parent homes, families rather, that's very difficult. For $1,700, we have to build something very small because it's impossible to build something with more rooms, for example. The bank will never let us do that. So I've been trying to explain that to the CMHC for years, to be able to change the system so that we can take, for example, single-parent homes and build them bigger homes, but nothing has ever changed. Thank you very much for your testimony. It speaks to the issues, and it's very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to Mr. Bachrach to finish off the day.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And one more question for Mr. Beaulieu-Gay. You talked about participation and the fact that small businesses and interested parties that perhaps don't have as many resources have differential access to regulatory processes and to advocacy around regulatory processes. So big companies are able to spend millions of dollars on lobbyists and influence regulatory change, whereas ordinary citizens, not-for-profit organizations, and small businesses have much less access. I'm just wondering about participation funding. When there are consultations or reviews of regulations that take place, should that be accounted for somehow so that government is hearing in an equitable way between large and small players in the environment.
Oui, ça serait une solution.
Yes, that would be a solution. That is to give them the means to participate. The most important thing is that they are able to participate early on in the process. For now, the consultations that are the most open and inclusive are at the end of the consultation process, the notice and comment section, where people have, 30, 60, 90 days to answer. And it's pretty much a done deal at that point. We have to allow people to participate before that point. That can be quite difficult because even the regulators themselves cannot know who's going to be impacted, all of the people who are going to be impacted. So, of course, they just turn to their network and people who they hear from often. And that means that we end up with people who informally are privileged. So I don't have a solution for you, but we have to find a way to try to include a larger diversity of participants earlier on in the process to make sure that small businesses, NGOs, and the people in general can have the word before the decisions are made.
Thank you very much. Witnesses, thank you very much for being with us today. We appreciate all the feedback and information you've provided for us. It's greatly appreciated. Just very quickly before we adjourn, again, happy birthday, Mr. Souza. October 3rd, I just want to update you regarding global affairs. We're still working on Minister Jolie with her schedule. I noticed that she was able to do some outreach with the Canada-Lebanese friendship group, so I'm hoping she'll make time for us as well. We will be open to whatever recommendations. The witness we had planned for the 3rd, Ms. Nicholson, we've set aside 2 hours. Right now, Global Affairs is trying to dictate to us 1 hour only. So we are, Clerk and I, working on that situation. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.